Hi, I'm Kathy Dodson, your pandemic potter, and today we're going to look at creating some owls out of extruded tubes. And the first thing that I would suggest is that you take a few minutes and Google owls or images of owls. Take a look at Pinterest and see the many varieties of owls there are, both imaginary and real, and decide what kind of an owl you'd like to make, because the possibilities are endless. This is an owl who has big cutout eyes and some slices taken out of the back to allow light to come through if you wanted to place this over a votive to make a lantern. And these make really nice lanterns. He has a hole in the top so the smoke can come out. But I also put a little notch in the back in case I wanted to use something with a cord to light him up. This owl is about 8 inches tall, but you could also make a little bitty screech owl if you wanted to. You could make an owl with huge, terrifying eyes, or you could make an owl that doesn't have cutouts at all, but instead has pieces placed on to create dimension. Now, this owl, instead of being open at the bottom, is open at the top, so that he might be a vessel of some sort. And so the closed off part is at the bottom. And you can do either way. This fella has wings that are marked on the side of his body. This fella has a couple of pieces attached to make wings, as well as some pieces that I've pressed onto the front. I just took circles and scored and slipped them and pressed those on to give the appearance of feathers. This guy has some wings on his side, as well as little ears. This ear sustained an injury, it looks like. And the wings on this owl stick out a little bit from the body of the lantern, and you have to be careful if you're going to have pieces that stick off, because they become vulnerable to breaking off as the piece dries or is maybe knocked around as it's put in the kiln. So be careful if you are have protruding parts to your owl, and just be mindful that they can be vulnerable. So as you think about what you'd like to do with your owl, if it's going to be a lantern and have some cuts for light to come out, those are all decisions that it's good to make. And so I'm going to show you how we go about taking our tube, extruded tube, and closing up either the top or the bottom and making an owl. Okay, once you have your extruded tube and a few tools, you're ready to go to make an owl. There are a couple of things that you'll need that you might not have used if you were working with slabs before. And one of those is a flat, smooth wooden tool. This is happens to be a clay tool, but you can also use a tongue depressor or a wooden ruler, which works really well. It's nice if you have a wooden spoon, particularly one that has a wide handle, and those I'll show you how to use in just a minute. You'll also need a cutting tool. Your bamboo skewer with a sharp point works, as well as a chopstick, and some tools that you can use for texture, and those can be really simple: a toothpick, a plastic fork, a straw. There are just a lot of things that you can use to make texture on your extruded tube. So think about how tall you'd like your owl to be, and take your tube and see if there's one end that is more suitable to being the bottom than the other. And this has sort of wonky ends at on both ends. So I'm going to cut one end clean with my cutting tool. And you can use your skewer for this. It does not have to be exact, because you can take it and tamp it on your table and make sure it's going to sit straight. And I think I'm going to make an owl who's about maybe 6 inches tall. So I'm going to cut off the top, and I might use that leftover tube for another project. So I'm going to put that aside. And notice that this tube, when it was extruded, ended up with a thicker wall on one side than the other. And we'll work with that. It doesn't make any difference, and we'll work with that in just a minute. But if you'll take your ruler or tongue depressor or flat wooden tool, we're going to start to shape the tube so that it's rounded at the top. And you may end up wanting to have an owl that has a flatter head, or you can make it rounded like these, or somewhere in the middle like this fella. So hold your ruler down at the bottom and start tapping your clay around the top edge. And what you'll see is that what happens is it compresses the clay toward the center, and our goal is to have it form a closed dome for your tube. It's sort of therapeutic, tapping on the clay, and try and keep your wooden utensil that you're tapping with as flat as you can so that it doesn't make deep indentations on your clay. You can always go back and repair those if it does. But just keep tapping and move a little bit down the cylinder so that you're sort of not getting too sharp a curve as it starts to bend its way toward the center. And just keep turning until you've gone all the way around. And you can see that it's coming in close to closing up. Now you could leave a space at the top, but I think it looks neater if you go ahead and tap it all the way closed, and then you can come back and cut out a space for the smoke to come out if you decide to use your owl as a lantern or a votive holder. And just keep tapping until you have managed to close up the opening. And now this one has almost completely disappeared. Now, if you're thinking that you might like to have your owl open at the top and have this be the closed bottom, you can certainly do that, in which case you just keep tapping it until the bottom is flattened, and then sit it down on your table and tap it until it is completely flat. And then this cut edge becomes the top of your vase or vessel or pencil holder, whatever else you want to make. But for now, I'm gonna leave my owl open at the bottom, and imagine that I'm gonna make him into a lantern. So his head is more or less ready at the top, I think. And depending on how you want to make your owl's face, you can cut out some holes for eyes. You can make them huge and terrifying like this fella. It's a little bit like carving a pumpkin. You kind of have to think about where you want the light to shine out. Now, for this one, I cut some little notches in the back, sort of smile-shaped notches, so that the light will shine out from both sides. You could do that in the front as well, but I figured the eye holes would be sufficient for that. So I'm going to take, I think what I'd like to do with this one, you see this fella has, I've put, I just used a snake around the outside edges of his eyes, and then I made a little beak for him out of a sort of a triangular piece of clay. But this fella looks like he's had a triangular piece applied so that becomes both his beak and sort of his forehead. I don't know if owls really have foreheads, but this fella has, it sort of comes up into a peak. I kind of like that idea. So I think what I'm going to take is a little piece of the clay that I cut off of my tube, and I'm going to make that into a ball, which I will then flatten out. And you can, and if you don't have a spare leftover clay from your slab, you can just roll this out with your jar or whatever you've got. In fact, this clay is a little bit dry, so I think I'm going to take some clay I've had under plastic. And remember that your clay will dry out fairly quickly if you don't cover it with plastic. So let's take some of this damp clay and roll it out a little bit until we have sort of a pancake that we can cut a piece out to make our owl's beak and forehead. So I think that that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sort of a triangle with curved sides that will become his sort of his horns and his beak. And because I'm going to be joining two pieces of clay, I want to score the back side of this one and think where I'm going to place it on my cylinder and score that a little bit as well, so that it doesn't fall off when they dry, because this clay is has a little bit more moisture in it than my extruded tube, and so they will dry at different rates. So I'm going to take a little bit of slip and apply it to the scoring and then press it on. And I think I'm going to let his ears stick up just a little bit. Now you want to be careful when you have protruding pieces on your work, as this fella does, because they become vulnerable to being knocked off, as one of the ears on this owl in progress did. And this fella that has wings that stick out, I want to try to be really careful to keep those pretty close to the base so that they don't get knocked off when he's being moved around. Now, if you have your wooden spoon, that's handy to put inside as you press something onto the outside, so that you're not caving in your cylinder. So I kind of like that for a face, and I'm going to think for a minute about what kind of eyes I'd like to make him. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to take my spoon and I'm going to just push the clay from the inside to stretch it just a little bit, particularly on this side where it's a little thicker, so that my owl has a little more rounded body rather than just a cylinder. And so you're just pulling the clay, pushing it out a little bit and pulling it so that it's a little bit thinner. and he's got a rounded shape. I'm not going all the way down to the base because I want it to be a little bit narrower like this one is. I want it to be a little bit narrower at the base, but you don't want it so narrow that he's in danger of tipping over whenever you sit him on a table. So there's a little bit of rounding, and you can compress your base a little bit, tap it down to make sure he's going to sit flat. And I've kind of squashed his little ear tufts there, so I'm going to poke those out just a little bit. And I think that I would like for him to have a similar eye treatment to this fella. And this dude has a similar thing going on with his eyes. He doesn't seem to want to lie flat. Lie next to your friend there. Okay. So I'm going to take some of this damp clay and make a snake that I'm going to apply around the edge of where his eyes will be. And if you can see, this fella has had the extra clay around the eyes has been deeply textured. It makes a really dramatic impact on his the texture there. So a shorter snake is a little bit easier to roll. So I'm going to take and make a fairly thin snake, and then I'm going to score where I think it'll go. So let's outline and make that roughly the same, and score around the circle where his eyes will be. Owls have such dramatic faces and such different shapes that no matter how you decide to do your eyes, it's sure to have an owl-like effect. So I'm going to score the back side of my snake here and give my scoring here a little bit of slip. So I'm going to take it and just lay that where it will go, and do the same for this one. Ah, how magic. I had just enough. So I'm going to take my spoon again and put it inside so that I can apply a little bit of pressure. In fact, that's a little bit wider than I needed. I'm just going to use the handle here. So take your smoothing tool and press that down and if your cylinder gets a little bit out of shape, you can go back in and fix it. There's a nice thing about having an open cylinder to work with. So that's how I want his rings around his eyes to look roughly. You can go back and smooth that a little bit later. You want to remember that anytime you have a cut or a rough edge, you want to go back and smooth it either with your finger or with a smoothing tool, so that when it's fired, you don't end up with any sharp, rough places. So there are his eyes. Oh. Okay. Okay. That's sort of an approximation of what I wanted. And so I'm going to take and decide how big I want his eyes to be. I think I want to cut them out. You can leave them if you want to, or you can cut them out. So I'm going to take my sharp tool and I'm going to cut out where his eyes will be, because I'd like for this to be a little lantern eventually. So now he has some eyes, and I'm not going to worry about a mouth somewhere under there, but I think what I am going to do is make some of these smiley cuts so that when he's illuminated, the light can shine and make nice patterns that way. And it's a little thinner toward the bottom, so I'm gonna have to reshape. Now, if we want our fella to have wings, which is certainly a benefit if you're an owl, I think I'm gonna take a ball of clay and flatten it out. Roll it a little bit if you want to. This does not have to be very thick, but you just do want to be careful that your edges don't get dry and crack. And if you'll smooth them a little bit and not make them thinner than the rest of the clay, you'll be okay. So I think I'm just going to make him have sort of a teardrop shaped wing, and I'm going to score that on the back and think about where that could go on my owl's body. So I think I'm gonna put it right about there. So I'll mark where he's gonna have a wing and give that a little bit of scoring, a little bit of slip, and press it in place. Now, I think it might be nice to leave the back part of the wing unattached to the body, but it's not sticking out so far that it's going to be in much danger of getting knocked off. And it's also fairly thick, so I'm not really worried about it snapping off. You don't want really thin pieces sticking out from your piece. So that's a pretty decent wing, and I'd like to have another wing of about the same size. So let's take another ball of clay, make another teardrop shape. And roughly the same size. So here is his other wing. I'm going to smooth the edges on that just a little bit. Rough up the back. See where he needs to go. Right about there. Give him a little scoring, a little slip. And there's his other wing. And he can stick out just a little bit as well. But that gives a little bit of interest to the back of your lantern. And I may go back and put some texture on there to suggest feathers, or you can take your skewer and make little marks to suggest feathers. And I'm also going to take You can just make marks, or you can, again, take your cutting tool and cut away some little slices. What it, you know, it can be diamonds, it can be little circles, whatever shape you choose, so that there's a place for the light to shine from both sides of your lantern. Okay. This must be the side of the tube that was thicker there. So think about how many of those you want to make. It's a pretty sturdy form, so you're not going to worry so much about the integrity of the piece if you put too many openings in it. But so you can put a number of those cuts in the back as well as the front. I would make a hole in the top, or it's going to be the clay is going to be fairly thick, because that's where you compressed all the edges to make your closed dome. So I'm going to cut a little piece there. See if I can poke that out with my chopstick, give it a little bit of roundness. And remember that it's going to shrink a little less than 20% when it's fired, so at least as big as a dime or a nickel is probably a good suggestion. And I would probably want to spend some more time smoothing my edges and adding cuts for the light to come through, maybe making some suggestion of feathers, and make sure that he sits flat. He doesn't look like he's about to fall over. You can add some more roundness with your ruler from the inside. Be sure before you take it back to the studio on Wednesday by 11 o'clock that you have put your initials or your name on the inside, and be thinking about how you would like to finish him on Glaze Day, which is Thursday. This fella had been dipped in iron oxide and not glazed at all, so that's a nice finish for an owl. You can also use Montreat Green or Blue Ridge, which is another darker, nice color. EMU, which is brown, it looks like a brown that's been dipped in blue, that always makes a nice finish. So think about what color you would like your owl to be, and have a good time.